Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Lunch and Learn from the School of Theology at the University of the South in Sewanee. This is the last of our series of Lunch and Learns for this particular academic year, and I'm very pleased today to welcome one of our newer members of staff, Mark Ardrey-Graves, who's the Assistant Professor of Church Music here. Mark holds degrees in musicology and historical performance practice from, please don't hold it against him, Duke, and a Doctor of Musical Arts in conducting from James Madison University. He was an organist and choir director at a number of Episcopal parishes in Virginia and North Carolina and survived that. He's also taught courses in jazz, music appreciation in North Carolina. He's passionately interested, quite appropriately, in liturgical music and performance practices of medieval, Tudor, and Restoration era music. He's also a member of the paramilitary wing of Restoration Music, in that he is a member of the Viola da Gamba Society of America, and shares a wedding anniversary with Sarah Ardrey-Graves, who's our Associate Dean for Spiritual and Professional Formation here at the School of Theology. If you don't know me, I'm Justin Anthony, the coordinator for Continuing Ed here, and I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Mark to talk to us on A Love Supreme, three American Psalms from 64 to 2023. If you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will attempt to present them to Mark in the time that we have at the end of class, at the end of this session, bearing in mind that he has to go and teach a class exactly on the hour. So we might not be able to get to all your questions, but we will attempt to do so. But Mark, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Justin, and greetings to all of you. It is wonderful for me to have this opportunity to share these thoughts with you this afternoon. By way of a very brief but honest disclaimer, I am not a biblical scholar. I am not a scholar of the Psalms. I have, as I'm sure many of you also, come to a lifelong relationship with the Psalms through praying them, through the liturgy, through singing them, and through experiencing them in communal worship. A number of points that I'm going to raise and discuss today, I need to acknowledge a couple of my teachers for their influence on this approach. Dr. Ellen Davis of Duke Divinity School, as well as Rabbi Stephen Sager from Durham, North Carolina. A very quick introduction. Psalms. As you all may recall, our word in English, psalms, comes from the Greek psalmoi, which has a bit of an indication that this word has to do with singing along with musical instruments, that there's an element of instruments and voices together in the etymology of this Greek word. The Hebrew word for the book of Psalms in the Bible, of course, Tehillim, which means praises, the book of praises. And when we are thinking about the scriptural canonical book of Psalms in the Bible, we are talking about the prayer book, the hymn book of both ancient Israel and the Jewish people, as well as the early church. There are, of course, psalms as such beyond the book of 150 in the Bible. We find the structure and form of psalms throughout the Hebrew scriptures. I think particularly of the prayer of Jonah in the second chapter of that book as a psalm form, as well as other places throughout the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. In the New Testament, we also find texts that follow this form of psalm, particularly in the Gospel of Luke, what the church liturgically refers to as canticles. A shorthand definition that I frequently will give to my students for a canticle is a New Testament Christologically focused psalm. The Psalms, of course, you may recall from your own study, follow typically particular forms of poetic structure, most notably that of parallelism, so-called rhymed ideas. These can follow synonymous or antithetic or expansive parallels, but often setting things off in pairs. The Psalms are also very, very deeply personal texts. We can consider the book of Psalms to be the place where we have words from humanity to God rather than going in the opposite direction. Many, if not most, are in the first person singular, but also are universal in scope, what some refer to as the collective or universal I. The book of Psalms is all about the universality of the human experience before God, be that in praise or thanksgiving or lament or cursing. And it must be emphasized that there is an explicit and implicit understanding that these are sung prayers. They always have been sung texts, sung prayers, not merely spoken words. We see from the outset a parallel development. Once we get to the first and second centuries with the advent of Christianity and the church, the tradition of chanting and singing the Psalms liturgically develops in parallel from the Jewish communities and the Christian communities. I think it's quite fascinating that there is some direct linkage across. I would like to call your attention to particularly this chant that many of you might recognize from use in worship of chanting the Psalms and other texts in daily office from the 1982 hymnal, the so-called tonus peregrinus, which in the Western Church and Eastern churches as well has long been linked with Psalm 114. And I find it particularly fascinating that the outline of this melody is nearly identical to the form of a chant melody from the Babylonian and Yemeni Jewish communities, also for Psalm 114, interestingly enough. So here is a specific example of a chant melody that is shared in common between the Jewish and Christian worshiping communities in singing the Psalms. Psalms are completely and unequivocally foundational in liturgical worship in both, again, Judaism and Christianity, synagogue and church. They are the anchors of the divine office, and if you explore deeply the core liturgical texts for the Mass, the Psalms are the linkage tissue between all these various portions of the liturgy. And as we progress through time in the music of the West, the Psalms, the texts of the Psalms are fertile ground for composers of liturgical and sacred music from the medieval period onward. This is the first stopping point for composers looking for texts to set for sacred music. Linguistically, in the West, this means Latin from the Vulgate translation of the Bible until the Reformation of the mid-16th century. Of course, in the Catholic Church, continuing in Latin until the 1960s with the results of the Second Vatican Council. And vernacular language psalms being the vanguard of the churches connected with the Protestant Reformation from the 16th century, both Lutheran and Reformed, the Anglican Church in that mix as well, thinking about singing metrical psalms. And also, again, these psalms being the basis for choral anthems in the English tradition, thinking about music such as that by William Byrd, Orlando Gibbons, Purcell, Handel, and so forth. The Psalms are the texts that we so often find for these choral works. And from this point of liturgical origin, the Psalms enter the canon of the so-called classical choral repertoire in Europe. Again, William Byrd, Handel, Palestrina, Monteverdi, Bach, Mozart, Mendelssohn, Brahms, Rachmaninoff, Stravinsky. It's hard to think of a composer of choral music who hasn't composed psalm settings, whether directly intended for liturgical use or not. In this so-called classical domain, whether intended for church or concert hall, These settings for choir are almost always either cast in Latin or one of the so-called classical vernacular languages, French, German, English. And finally, by way of introduction, I want to emphasize that any musical setting of a scriptural text, including and perhaps even especially the Psalms, any musical setting of a scriptural text bears the responsibility of serving as an exegesis of that text. So, with these introductory thoughts in mind, I would like to turn our attention to three different musical settings of words that are psalms, one of which being a setting of biblical, scriptural, canonical psalms, and the other two being settings of texts that are not scriptural but are nevertheless referred to as psalms. The common thread between these three is they are all products of American musicians from the 20th and 21st centuries. And we will begin by looking at what, in some respects, perhaps is the most traditional or canonical way of thinking these texts, although it has its own distinctive characteristics as well. And that is the Chichester Psalms composed by Leonard Bernstein. Brief review of Bernstein himself. He was born in 1918 in Massachusetts. He was the child of Russian, Ukrainian, Jewish immigrants to the United States. A composer, pianist, conductor, humanitarian, educator. Bernstein really was the first American-born orchestral conductor, both to be the director of a major American symphony orchestra, as well as the first American-born conductor to achieve international stature as a conductor. 16 Grammy Awards, 7 Emmy Awards, 2 Tony Awards. He was nominated for an Oscar for a film score. And he himself would talk about how his own Jewish background, his own Jewish identity, pervades much of his own compositional output and perspective. Bernstein was also an early king of the soundbite. In his own words, here's a couple of quotations from Bernstein. "This will be our reply to violence, to make music more intensely, more beautifully, and more devotedly than ever before. And music can name the unnameable and communicate the unknowable. A work of art does not answer questions, it provokes them." In 1965, Bernstein completed a commission that was offered to him by the Southern Cathedrals Festival in the United Kingdom, which is an annual 5-day music festival that rotates between Salisbury, Winchester, and Chichester cathedrals in the south of England. And the Chichester Psalms was the result of that commission. He actually premiered it in New York City a couple of weeks before the festival itself in July of that year, and then it received its first performance at the festival at the end of July in 1965. It is composed for 4-part choir, vocal soloists, and an orchestra that includes harp and percussion. Bernstein himself also arranged it for a chamber ensemble, replacing the orchestra with an organ while retaining the harp and percussion instruments. It is cast in 3 distinct movements, each with texts that Bernstein himself collected from the Book of Psalms. Each movement pairs 2 different psalms together. The first combining verses from Psalms 108 and 100. The second, which we're going to focus on here in just a minute, combining the entirety of Psalm 23 with verses from Psalm 2. And the third, which should make all Sewanee people quite happy, verses from Psalm 131 and 133. One of the distinctive elements of this piece is that Bernstein chose to use the Hebrew language for all of these texts. This was not his first time using Hebrew texts in a composition. His second symphony involves the Kaddish prayer in Hebrew. But in this commission, in this setting, he's done something quite remarkable that, to the best of my research here, this is the first time that a composer in the Western classical idiom has composed a work that sets texts of the book of the Psalms in the Hebrew language that is not expressly written for synagogue use, but rather for concert hall. And we also often will find church choirs singing this music. So for the first time in a non-synagogue specific context, we have a composer in the Western idiom using the Hebrew language for the texts of the Psalms. As I mentioned, each movement combines verses from two different psalms. And so we see here, in that sense, there's a structure that has an echo of liturgical use of psalmody, which will frequently combine verses of psalms. But Bernstein's combination of texts in the way that he does in this piece is novel, particularly in the second movement, combining the 23rd Psalm with the second Psalm. In Bernstein's hands, the exegetical element of musical setting goes a step further than surface musical exegesis. In his novel way of combining different psalms together in each movement, he is offering what I consider to be a musical midrash on these psalms, in which each psalm excerpt is involved in theological conversation with the other psalm excerpt, resulting in a deeper probing into the psalm texts and what they are communicating. Themes we see throughout include ecumenism, joy in tension with conflict, the brotherhood of man, that's a quote from Bernstein himself, assurance, serenity, comfort, and unity. We're going to see especially this idea of a struggle between comfort and strife in the middle core second movement of the piece. Here in the second movement, for the first time, we have a solo soprano voice, which the composer designates specifically as being a boy soprano. He also allows for an adult male countertenor voice, but he is very adamant in his description of the music that this should be sung by a boy or a young man as a direct connection to the figure of David. This soloist represents David himself, with the harp accompanying also a linkage to the biblical imagery of David playing the harp. Bearing in mind, of course, that the biblical King David did not play a modern orchestral harp. Nevertheless, that's what we have here in this music. The boy soprano, after beginning the verses of Psalm 23, is then accompanied by the rest of the soprano section. And it's also worth noting that in 1965, the combined cathedral choirs of Chichester, Salisbury, and Winchester cathedrals would have been boy sopranos singing that part in the choir. Then, after the first four verses of Psalm 23, the tenors and basses interrupt the singing of the psalm with verses from Psalm 2. You will hear, we're going to listen to this movement, you will hear the tenors and basses interrupt the 23rd Psalm. Why do the nations furiously rage together? The kings of the earth rise up against the Lord. Before we return again to the conclusion, verses 5 and 6 of Psalm 23, when David, the soprano, re-enters with the harp. And it's interesting, in the score itself, Bernstein writes at that moment where the 23rd Psalm returns, he writes a performance indication that the sopranos should be blissfully unaware of threat in how they sing these verses. Then at the very end, you will hear this rumbling from Psalm 2 return yet again, as if to signify the ongoing struggle between comfort and strife. So let's listen now to the second movement of this. So it would seem that the composer has left the answer to the question a bit open in this struggle between where now is your God and surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. That struggle is left a bit unresolved at the end of that movement. And in fact, if we had time, we look at how the third movement begins with an orchestral interlude that's very dissonant and strained before we get Psalm 131 coming in. And ultimately, at the end of the piece, the answer seems to be that assurance and comfort and peace will get the last word, but it's not a guarantee, as we've heard how the second movement ends, that that conversation is fully finished. So Bernstein has created this unique musical exegetical voice for biblical psalms. Now I'd like for us to turn to two musical works that are not scriptural biblical psalms, but are called psalms, and to see what the musical voice that we can uncover there has to teach us. First, we're going to stay in the year 1965, the same year as Chichester Psalms, with John Coltrane and his remarkable album, A Love Supreme. Very brief overview of Coltrane. Born in 1926 in Hamlet, North Carolina, and as an infant, his family moved up the road to High Point, North Carolina, where he grew up. Joined the military in World War II, and then after the war settled in New York City. He grew up in a very religious household. Both of his grandfathers on both sides were clergy in the AME Zion tradition, so he grew up in a very church-saturated family environment. And during the war and then after the war, he got very much, he played in band in high school, and then that was his entry point into the world of jazz as a horn player, and sort of navigating the landscape of jazz in post-war America, first playing in a swing band with Jimmy Heath, and then being exposed in the 1940s by way of Charlie Parker to the genre of bebop, and then following his time with Parker, coming under the influence of Miles Davis and Thelonious Monk in 1950s, what we call post-bop, modern bop, and then Coltrane himself becoming a trailblazer in the evolution of jazz in what is known as modal jazz, and more generally speaking, avant-garde jazz in the late 1950s through the rest of his life into the 1960s. Jazz would not sound the way it does today if it were not for the innovations that Coltrane himself led the way with. Bit of biography also, beginning in around the year 1948, Coltrane had a struggle, a nearly decades-long struggle with addiction, both alcohol and heroin. And he actually was fired by Miles Davis from his band twice because of his heroin habit. And if you know anything about Miles Davis's biography, there's some irony there. But what's notable here is that in 1957, Coltrane quit his heroin habit, cold turkey, in a fairly short amount of time, and which is all the more remarkable when you think about how heroin works on a person. For him to simply have this moment of dropping and quitting the habit is very remarkable. And he himself attributed part of that recovery process to a religious experience, conversion experience he had. In his own words, I experienced by the grace of God a spiritual awakening which was to lead me to a richer, fuller, more productive life. At that time, in gratitude, I humbly asked to be given the means and privilege to make others happy through music. And we see from 1957 this switch in his entire approach, not only to how he's making music and playing music, but what he understands music to be as a part of his life moving forward. I mentioned, well, first of all, the album Love Supreme, recorded at the end of 1964, released in early 1965, representing a autobiographical musical expression for Coltrane. It is meant to be an ongoing multi-movement through composed suite of pieces in four sections, but the idea that Coltrane had behind this is it's one continuous musical expression through these four sections: acknowledgement, resolution, pursuance, and psalm. And we're going to focus on, as you might have guessed, psalm at the end of this album. This whole album is Coltrane through the medium of improvisatory avant-garde jazz expression, pointing to his religious, spiritual conversion, awakening experience. It's very distinctive in its makeup of the instrumentation. He uses a lot of unusual percussion instruments like gongs in addition to the jazz combo itself. And looking at the fourth movement, Psalm in particular, there's a lot of innovation here. There's no musical score. There's no chart of an outline of a melody and chord progressions. Instead, what Coltrane has done in this piece is he wrote out a prayer, a text that he calls his psalm. And we're actually going to watch a video in a couple of minutes that has in his own handwriting his piece of music, his piece of paper where he wrote the psalm out. And so when they went into the studio, he took that sheet that had the text of the poem, the psalm that he wrote, and put that on the music stand in front of him. And what he proceeds to do is take his saxophone and essentially play the words of this text through his horn, as if it is the saxophone itself that is singing the text of the psalm. So it is improvised, but it is not improvisation the way we normally think of. There are elements here. A lot of commentators have talked about how there's a linkage here to the tradition of homiletics in the Black church, African American preaching styles. There are elements of glossolalia, speaking in tongues, involved, where the saxophone itself is interpreting the text of the psalm. So on its surface, this sounds like an instrumental, textless piece of music, but there is very much a text that is driving the production of this music, and that is the psalm that Coltrane has himself written. Coltrane develops basically a cult following around himself as a religious figure. We can see here this icon of Coltrane. We hear throughout the whole album of A Love Supreme this mantra, A Love Supreme. And as I mentioned, there are elements of Black preaching involved here. But here's an interesting thing about Coltrane and his post-conversion experience understanding of music. He sees music as a universal language that in of itself has religious and spiritual depth. In his own words again, I would like to bring to people something like happiness. I would like to discover a method so that if I want it to rain, it will start right away to rain. If one of my friends is ill, I'd like to play a certain song and he will be cured. When he'd be broke, I'd bring out a different song and immediately he'd receive all the money he needed. So I think we can see here that he's moved beyond orthodox Christian understandings of how the world works, how God works, and how music works, but nonetheless, he's pulling into something very, very innate and deep about the power that music has as an expression and communication with the divine. Some of you might recognize this image at the bottom of the slide here. This is a portion of the mural that's on the wall at St. Gregory of Nyssa Episcopal Church in San Francisco, where Coltrane is there on the far right among the dancing saints. And you can see again the Holy Spirit fire in the bell of his saxophone there. In a 1966 interview, he was asked by the interviewer, "What do you hope to be in 5 years?" And his answer without hesitation was, "A saint." Well, sure enough, 5 years later, 1971, the Yardbird Temple in San Francisco, the leadership of that church saw Coltrane himself as a divine incarnation. A few years later, the Yardbird Temple joined the African Orthodox Church group and kind of backpedal a little bit and said, well, Coltrane is not divine himself, but he is a saint of the church. And so in that corner of Christendom, at least, we have an acknowledgement of the very mystical, universalist-minded Coltrane acknowledged as a saint. And we have here him at St. Gregory of Nyssa in San Francisco. Well, without further ado, I would like us now to listen to Psalm from A Love Supreme and thinking about the Genesis. And what you're going to see on this video is a scrolling score that's going to involve the text in Coltrane's handwriting tracked right on top of the music, so we can really get a sense of how his saxophone is playing the text. And what I would like for you to do as you're listening to this is thinking about the ways in which this psalm is both like and unlike biblical psalms. So I would argue that a number of elements are present here that point to this a biblical psalm. Coltrane addresses God in the first person singular, you, thou. He addresses God as a divine being with whom the individual can and does have an intimate relationship. Throughout the text, it does involve changes in pronominal address. There are shifts between talking to and talking about God throughout that many psalms also feature. It is a prayer of praise and thanksgiving. If we were to categorize it in one of those genres of psalm, it would be a psalm of thanksgiving, a psalm of praise. The psalmist, here Coltrane, enjoins his fellow humans to praise and worship God. It includes teaching and instruction. And the address of God alternating between God and Lord, which we also see in scriptural psalms. Now, how is it unlike a biblical psalm? It does not originate from within a specifically Hebrew, Jewish, cultural, or cultic context. The implication is that Coltrane's God is to be identified with Adonai, but that also cannot be directly assumed. Coltrane's own religious cosmology would point to a both and, a yes and understanding of God. His audience is also not specifically that of the biblical psalmists, although one could argue that the audience is the world. So maybe that's not as specific of a point. He also doesn't use these formal structures of Hebrew poetry that we've talked about. The parallelism, the rhymed ideas or phrasal couplets are not really here. He includes many short standalone phrases and uses unique imagery that sets it apart from biblical psalmic imagery. Thought waves, heat waves, all vibrations. So, a psalm, but also a more expansive psalm from the ethos of biblical psalms. So now we're going to turn finally to one other expression of non-biblical psalms called psalms that are going to take some of this same expansive energy and idea. And that is Paul Simon and his 2023 album entitled Seven Psalms. Simon, like Leonard Bernstein, also the child of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, in this case, Hungarian Jewish immigrants, grew up in New Jersey and New York City. Also, like Leonard Bernstein, has won 16 Grammy Awards. Simon himself, in recent interviews, has pointed to the overarching themes found in his music: love, family, social commentary, and religion, spirituality, and God. With Paul Simon's songs, God is never that far away from the surface, hovering kind of right below the surface in many places. Here's Paul Simon talking about his own songwriting process. The music always precedes the words. The words often come from the sound of the music and eventually evolve into coherent thoughts, or incoherent thoughts. Rhythm plays a crucial part in the lyric making as well. It's like a puzzle to find the right words to express what the music is saying. So it's interesting to note that for much of his songwriting, Paul Simon writes the music first and then fits words. But we're going to see the opposite process at play here in this particular collection, Seven Psalms. So Paul Simon had retired from touring at the end of 2018 and was looking at winding down his career. He was also suffering from pretty severe hearing loss in one ear. But in January of 2019, he awoke from a vivid dream, and in this dream he heard a voice clearly say, "You are working on a piece called Seven Psalms." And he says, gradually information would come. I would start to wake up 2 or 3 times a week at 3:30 in the morning. and words would come. I'd write them down and start to put them together. He actually wasn't quite sure how to write a psalm, so he went to the Bible to explore psalmody in the Bible. And he says, this is a journey for me to complete. This whole thing is really an argument I'm having with myself about belief or not. Again, like Coltrane's album, this is meant to be one continuous flow of music, not 7 separate psalms or songs, but one text that goes. It's all acoustic, mostly just him and his guitar, with minimalist backup musicians, creating an effect of immediacy and intimacy. The first section, called The Lord, repeats a number of times through the album. And we're going to listen to the third section, My Professional Opinion, which will then recap that opening, The Lord. This is very personal, as you will hear. So let's listen now to this excerpt from Simon's 7 Psalms.
Good morning, Mr. Indignation. Looks like you haven't slept all night. In my professional opinion, go back to bed, turn off your light. I'm not a doctor or a preacher. I've no particular guiding star. In my professional opinion, I'm no more satisfied than you are. So what in the world are we whispering for? Everyone's naked, there's nothing to hide. Gonna carry my grievances down to the shore, wash them away in the tumbling tide. I heard 2 cows in a conversation. One called the other one a name. In my professional opinion, all cows in the country must bear the blame. So all rise to the occasion, or all sink into despair. In my professional opinion, we're better off not going there. Oh, what in the world are we whispering for? Everyone's naked, there's nothing to hide. Gonna carry my grievances down to the shore and wash them away in the tumbling tide. Wash them away in the tumbling tide. Wash them away in the tide. All that really matters is the one who became us, anointed, and gained us with his opinion. The Lord is my engineer. The Lord is the earth I ride on. The Lord is the face in the atmosphere, the path I slip and slide on. The Lord is a virgin forest, the Lord is a forest ranger, the Lord is a mule for the poorest of the poor, a welcome door to the stranger.
And we'll end it there, though there's always something else with Paul Simon. But same questions as with Coltrane. How are these like biblical psalms? Well, he definitely invokes biblical imagery. He specifically at one point talks about David and his harp. There's a recurring image of healing waters. There's the common name for God throughout this of the Lord, as we heard there right at the end, and offers descriptive imagery of God and the Lord in lists of attributes. The Lord is this, the Lord is that. The Lord is the earth I ride on. The Lord is the ocean rising. It's very personal texts, like the Psalms. This is personal for Simon, and covers different genres. There's thanksgiving, there's praise, doubt. They are all on display here. Simon brings his full, honest self before God. How is this unlike a biblical psalm? Well, like Coltrane, this does not originate from within a specifically Hebrew Jewish cultural or cultic context, although it must be said Paul Simon himself is Jewish. This exemplifies Simon's evasive and sometimes obfuscatory poetic imagery. I would argue this is as much T.S. Eliot as it is psalmist. These texts are neither orthodox nor agnostic. These are psalms for the uncertain 21st century seeker. There's also some pointing to fairly overt Christian imagery here. Go carry my grievances down to the shore, wash them away in the tumbling tide. All that really matters is the one who became us, anointed, and gained us with his opinion. So where does that leave us? So what? Well, I leave you with a few questions to ponder. I don't pretend to have answers to these, but let's ask the questions. What is at stake with these songs being called psalms? Is the canon closed on psalmody, which is another way of asking, are psalms fixed texts, or are they instead a poetic form? And as a poetic form, is that poetic form still in play? Are psalms therefore different from other genres of biblical writing? And who decides the rules? What must a text include to be a psalm or not? What must they contain? Does psalmody require a hermeneutical community of assent to be called such? Does it require an a priori consensus on the identification of God? Can anything named psalm be a psalm simply because it's given that name? Is there something distinctive in the religious landscape of North American experience that points to a porosity, a porous understanding of psalmody beyond canonical scripture? I would also offer this question. Humanity's instinctual response to an encounter with the divine is often poetry and song. If psalms are, at their core, humanity's sung prayers to God, then how do we differentiate between the hymns of the church, whether from Ephraim the Syrian, Isaac Watts, or Fanny Crosby, and texts such as these that are called psalms? How does the church responsibly allow room for the divine to speak back to us through poetry and song? With this idea of porosity in genre, can we encounter God speaking to us through unexpected perhaps, through the words and songs of our fellow pilgrims. Thank you.
Mark, thank you so much. I am aware of the time, and so I'm going to make a unilateral decision that as you have finished your presentation, your excellent and very moving presentation with a whole series of questions for us, then that's the way that the direction questions should go, is questions from the speaker to the audience. Questions from people as different as Bernstein, John Coltrane, and Paul Simon as well, questions to us. Thank you so much. And it was so wonderful to hear Paul Simon put in conversation with those other composers too. For those of you who have joined us for this academic year for Lunch and Learn, thank you very much indeed for your support. If you would like Lunch and Learns to continue, you have an opportunity to support the seminary in its mission for forming people in a devout, learned, and useful way to be of service to God and God's church. Please do consider prayerfully what you can do to support us financially as well as through your prayers. The new academic year will have new Lunch and Learns, usually on the first Tuesday of the month. That program will be ready in the middle of May for you to see and to sign up. There will be faces new and I'm not going to say faces old, but faces that will be familiar for you to see what the continuing engagement of the faculty here at the School of Theology with the big questions of the day about how we can be God's faithful people will continue then.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much, Christian.